Well, they weren't really extradited, were they, Angie? I mean, an extradition implies a legal basis for that and a treaty between two countries. Your country kidnapped them.
Listen, we've been throwing around that word a lot, but apparently it is very legal. And I've actually seen this happen with much smaller players going into Costa Rica and going into Colombia.
Were they? They weren't extradited. They were abducted.
That single word changes everything, because this debate isn't really about whether Nicolás Maduro deserved to be removed. It's about whether the most powerful country on earth just showed the world that rules only apply to the weak.
Well, one of the intriguing subplots, I think, behind all of this kind of genealogy of what has happened in Venezuela is Donald Trump, essentially, for all intents and purposes these days, being a political Floridian. He, of course, is a famous New Yorker by birth and for much of his career, but politically he's been aligned and living in Florida for many, many years now. It is his political home state. And, of course, telling as well that he wasn't announcing yesterday at the press conference everything that had happened from the White House briefing room or having been in the White House Situation Room, but instead he was in his retreat, really. The Russians call it a dacha, or dasha, the palatial setting of Mar-a-Lago in Palm Beach in Florida. He is someone now who is anchored in Floridian politics, and Floridian politics of all parts of the United States takes the keenest interest for obvious geographical, political, cultural regions in the politics of Latin America and South America. Marco Rubio.
This opening matters because it explains motive. When foreign policy becomes domestic messaging, decisions stop being about law and start being about power, optics, and audience.
He also hails from that political lineage as well, telling he was there, but the Vice President, J.D. Vance, who is said to be a little more sceptical about what has happened, perhaps with an eye, of course, on 2028 and his own prospects in a MAGA movement which, of course, historically has been and set itself against American foreign entanglements. Donald Trump's own extraordinary rise to the presidency could not have happened without the twin midwives of the 2008 financial crash and everything that happened afterwards, and Iraq, which so completely delegitimized the old Republican establishment, the hawks, the neocons, the security hawks, the Dick Cheneys and John Boltons of this world, on whom Trump relied on his first term, but dispatched in his second term, and is now doing things that arguably would have made those men blush. Let's get the view now from Florida and from the United States with Angie Wong, who's U.S. political commentator, Republican delegate from Florida, or been celebrating, we understand, Maduro's.
This is important context. A leader who rejects convention at home is unlikely to respect convention abroad. And that's exactly where this story begins to accelerate.
Capture on the streets of Florida in the last 24 hours. Angie, lovely to speak to you. Why have you been celebrating Maduro's capture?
Good morning, Lewis. Yes, we've been celebrating for over 24 hours now. As soon as the news broke here on the East Coast at 2 a.m. yesterday, we heard cars honking, we saw music blasting, and that's typical night in Miami, of course. But this was different. This was people lining up in Little Havana, going to Doral in Florida, and flying Venezuelan flags, and it was great. So I was part of that yesterday morning and been reporting on it. It's been so glorious because we have so many Venezuelan refugees here, and so many have fled with literally nothing. I have a barista that I loved going to. Her family was very wealthy in Venezuela 10 years ago, and now she is working at a coffee shop because she's lost everything. So we hear stories like that over and over again. So they were just loving this because
emotion dominates this moment. Pain, exile, and resentment fuel the celebrations. But emotion alone cannot answer the legal and moral questions that follow.
There is a lot of concern in Europe and in the UK this morning, Angie, and there will be in the United States as well. Not from you and the people celebrating, perhaps, but from others. Not so much about the ends. No one really thinks that Maduro should have stayed in place. He was an illegitimate dictator. He'd subverted elections and so on. But about the means, about going in to a sovereign country in this way and abducting a foreign leader in this manner, the legal basis for that. Do you not have any concerns about that at all and the precedent that it sets?
Yes, and yesterday morning when I first heard the news break, I was thinking, well, why did the U.S. reach out to NATO? Why didn't we look into our allies so that we weren't the only ones going in? But then when you look at the legal basis of why Maduro and his wife was arrested, it was based on drug charges. pending in the U.S. So they were convicted under Joe Biden in 2020 in the Southern District Court in New York, which I'm very familiar with. It's in Brooklyn. And
here, the tone shifts. The discussion moves away from celebration and into dangerous territory, because how something is done can matter more than why it was done.
And they were then essentially extradited from Caracas to go to New York to face these charges. So that's what's happening here.
Well, they weren't really extradited, were they, Angie? I mean, an extradition implies a legal basis for that and a treaty between two countries. Your country kidnapped them.
Listen, we've been throwing around that word a lot, but apparently it is very legal. And I've actually seen this happen with much smaller players going into Costa Rica and going into Colombia.
Were they? They weren't extradited. They were abducted.
Once extradition disappears, only force remains. And force, when used without rules, doesn't stay contained to one situation.
It was a very, very special extradition. Let's put it that way. Now, I mean, look, I agree with you. I think, in all fairness, I think that the UK, I think Starmer said it right, and other world leaders have said, look, this is going against international laws. And I think that's going to be tested. But who's going to test that? Right? Which court of law is actually going to bring in the Trump administration to stress test whether or not there was a kidnapping or anything beyond an extradition? I don't know. And quite honestly, I don't know if they'll care, because now what you've seen is that you've been seeing celebrations around the world from freed Venezuelans.
So is it okay that the United States gets, because of its power and because you've got this extraordinary military and you've got this extraordinary might, it's okay that the United States is judge, jury, and executioner over everything that it does? And it could do this, as President Trump has said, it could do it again with other leaders. Is that a good thing?
This is where the stakes explode, because this is no longer about Venezuela. It's about a global system that depends on powerful nations choosing restraint.
And that's the messaging, isn't it? That is sending a message to Russia, to China, to Iran, to Colombia, who just closed its borders, to Cuba, to anyone who is an adversary to the U.S. And that's exactly what Marco Rubio, President Trump, and Pete Hegseth wanted to give out.
Well,
look, is it okay? Of course not. I don't believe so. I just said, I think the UN, NATO, perhaps even other allies, maybe the UK could have joined in on this. But they didn't.
But it could send a different message, couldn't it, Angie? It could send a message to Beijing and to Moscow that as long as you've got the military clout, you can do whatever you want, and that you could do something like this as well. What is to stop President Putin deciding, well, actually, it's in our national security interest, we're going to try President Zelensky in a Moscow court, and then, when we're able to, and when we've got the military capability, we're going to conduct our own special military operation, so to speak, a special extradition, so to speak, and remove him to Moscow and put him on trial. What's to stop them doing that?
Once rules become optional, they stop protecting anyone. Not allies, not democracies, not even the countries that break them first off.
Oh, 100%. President Trump pretty much on day one wanted Greenland. Remember, he also wanted Canada. He also wants the Panama Canal. Look, you can't not call this guy a modern day imperialist, right? He wants the same thing that Putin wants, that Xi Jinping wants, that even Bibi Netanyahu wants. They want more land. And right now, I don't think anyone is pushing to stop him, but he's not going into wars necessarily. He's not like Putin going in and just bringing in the troops across the border. He's trying to make a deal, and whether or not that deal is successful, we're not sure. But we know that the envoy working on Greenland, this is not going to be boots on the ground. We're not invading.
This is the moment the mask slips. When power no longer pretends to be principle, the world has to decide whether it accepts that reality or resists it.
Depress you, Angie? Does it not depress you that many of us around the world, many in America, always thought that perhaps America was rather better than this, that America wasn't imperialist, that America won over the rest of the world because of her ideas and the principles that your country stood for. And instead, you're basically talking about your president and your country in the same breath and in the same way, with the same ends and the same means as the Xis and the Putins and the Chinas and the Russias.
So now the question is yours to answer. Was Maduro legally captured, or was he kidnapped under the cover of power? Does removing a dictator justify breaking international rules, or does that make the world more dangerous for everyone? Share your thoughts in the comments. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more serious debate and unfiltered analysis.